The mayor also highlighting how a series of coalition administrations had affected the running of the city, in his view.
Our city has been governed by various coalitions, which introduced a new era in the politics and governance of Johannesburg. This new political reality has introduced a myriad of challenges, both for governance and politics. More importantly, it has introduced unprecedented levels of instability, especially under the various DA-led multi-party coalitions.
Well, as you know, we've been seeing more and more coalitions in local government. Now, is this a major problem? Lwazi Sikiti is a policy and advocacy manager at the South African Cities Network. Lwazi, good evening to you and thank you for the time. We see so many people blaming coalitions and coalition politics for the problems of governance in local government. Is it just coalitions, or are there other big important factors as well?
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for having me. Yes and no. I would say definitely coalitions have a large part to do with preventing governments from making decisive decisions. That's one feature that has predominantly come up as a challenge in these power-sharing arrangements, where the decisions are essentially made collectively through whatever decision trading behind the scenes that happens. But eventually what then becomes a done or committed decision is kind of divorced from direct ownership. So there's no person who can say, I was party to this decision, because it was a joint collective decision. So it becomes hard then, Stephen, to own the failures, and it also becomes hard essentially to also own the successes in this kind of environment of coalitions.
You make an important point that people just don't make decisions at all, and is that the risk? The non-decisions mount up over time. No one invests in infrastructure. There's no 5-year plan to deal with electricity in Joburg, for example, because no one thinks they're going to be in power for 5 years, so it's not worth it.
It is. We are at that phase, unfortunately, where we are still relatively new to the space of coalition politics in our country, and by extension in our cities. So it's still a very wet behind the ears approach that we're all kind of figuring out as we go. But there's gradual maturity, or rather discussions around how to make these coalitions more matured, so that they can essentially put their differences aside and start focusing more on the interest of the public and service delivery. But it is a natural progression, in my view, where we are, that we would have this kind of teething problems.
So often we blame the politicians and the politicians blame each other. Now, it's easy to point to voters and say voters should stop voting for so many different parties. But, I mean, that would be an undemocratic stance in my view. So what can voters do? I mean, how can they hold people accountable? And even between elections, it seems probably impossible for most people to do that.
Yeah, that's the interesting part, Stephen. I think with what is happening now, I think we also find ourselves in a period where this notion of active citizenry is now needed more than ever. Gone are the days where we could use politicians as proxies to make decisions about our well-being. So it means that there needs to be a more active engagement from the citizenry side in what is sometimes called as all-of-society approach. So I think the voters need to also take it upon themselves, organize themselves, and hold their leaders into account, and ensure that the decisions that are made by politicians in those chambers are actually representing the real decisions that they had entrusted them in the elections. So I think active citizenry is needed now more than ever.
One of the things that you see in Joburg, but I could be speaking about the Tsubotla, I could be speaking about Mangaung, I could be speaking about so many other places, eThekwini, is that there is no investment in infrastructure. I mean, eThekwini is facing court cases in which national and provincial government departments have said the municipality, this is a big metro, has not properly invested in fixing its water infrastructure. That's why there's been so much sewage, I could use another word, so much sewage on the beaches, in the rivers. I mean, it's frankly disgusting. And I'm being incredibly polite when I say that. So that's about a failure of many things. It's probably about a failure of politics. But I think many people are worried that actually it's just going to get worse. We're going to see more sewage in local government.
Absolutely. I mean, there's talk that if we thought this power crisis was the big thing, wait until we face the water crisis that is going to come. Because, yes, you're right, there has been a gradual lack of investment in some of the key infrastructure, and compounded by the fact that our cities have been growing, and there's a lot of developments that have been happening all around, from the townships right through to the suburbs. Huge housing developments have happened, and some of them have not happened with the commensurate investments in the bulk infrastructure. So that has now put much more pressure on the existing infrastructure, and hence we're seeing these cracks, if you want to call it that, in the infrastructure. And it is a very alarming thing, but it's not only foreign to us here in South Africa. Big cities such as New York also have these kind of issues. It's just part of how do you balance supply and demand of services, and then coupled with all the other shenanigans around decisions not being made on time, cash being diverted to all sorts of nefarious activities. That all boils down to what we see now, essentially a crumbling infrastructure system.
Is there a spiral, a trap that a metro, a council can fall into? Maybe you could call it a Ditsobotla trap. If you don't spend enough money on infrastructure, people stop paying, because you can't run an economy if you don't have infrastructure. And everything starts to spiral downwards, unfortunately. I mean, Joburg may not be there right now. Some parts may. I mean, the roads literally disappeared in parts of Hillbrow, for example. How, if you're going down that trap, if you're going down that downward spiral, how do you get out of it?
Well, it starts with essentially facing the problem head on. I think what is also unfortunate is that the golden years where the cities enjoyed large surpluses of finances are also gone. We are in this downward pedestrian economic conditions we're in now. So cash is tight, and cities need to really prioritize wisely. And that is why it's very important to have the right people representing the citizens at councils, because these are very, very, very mature decisions of what needs to be done now and what can be done later, and really rein in everyone on those decisions, because the cash is tight. We can't fix everything. If you look at the roads network alone in Joburg, I think there was a circular that went out around how many thousands of kilometers of our network need upgrading, but the city only had enough budget to do a few hundred. So the question now becomes, which ones out of that 100 kilometers of network are we going to start with, and how do we arrive at that decision? It must stop being a question of my constituency must come first, which is what the natural inclination politicians will have. But it's time to really look at what will improve the resilience of the city. So we need a leadership that now is more focused than ever on how to create resilience in our cities.
Lwazi Sikiti, thank you. Policy and Advocacy Manager at the South African